everyone, and welcome back to Manifested. For this hot take episode, summer has come to a close. We are now in fall officially, so students are headed back to school, which makes us think it's time to start reviewing those books that we read over the summer. What was our summer reading? Today, I'll be joined by a close friend and colleague, James Reilly. James and I often swap recommendations in the office, but he's an avid reader, and we wanted to invite him on the channel today to share his recommendations with you as well. James, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Thank you, Alex. I'm so excited to be here today and to get to join Manifest Ed for the first time. Particularly interested to hear from you, Alex, about the book that you read this summer and learn as much as I can. And I'm also thrilled to have the chance to share a little bit about one of the education books I read this summer and some of my takeaways. A bit of background about me, James Reilly. I've been at Google for the past 3.5 years. And all that time, I've been working in the education space at Google. In my current role, I lead strategy and operations for our education vertical, which is our organization that supports higher education institutions and ed tech organizations in a variety of ways using all of Google's products and solutions. And Alex, I'm going to turn over to you to kick things off and learn a little bit more about what you read this summer, and can't wait to hear all about it.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us today, James. Today, the book I'll be reviewing is Scott Galloway's PostCorona. This book was truly a page-turner, extremely readable. I read it on the beach, I read it at the pool, and as you can see, I even lost the book jacket. But this book was really good, certainly timely, knowing that we are emerging through coronavirus. The world is starting to return a little bit to normal, so that it was perfectly timely. But Professor Scott Galloway starts his book off by posing two theses. The first is that the pandemic's most enduring result will be as an accelerant, which I know we've been saying a lot in education, why sliding the online education trend forward by 10 years. But he also poses that in any crisis, there is opportunity, and the greater the crisis, the greater the opportunity. Similarly, he shared a quote that I know many of us have heard lately, and that's that nothing can happen for decades, and then decades can happen in weeks, and that's from the Scottish MP George Galloway. So funny that the last name is shared there, but he also spoke through an out-of-industry example, which we always love to point to as context for what we might be seeing going on in our own industry. But if we look back at retail and e-commerce in particular, we know e-commerce began in around 2000. So if you fast forward from 2000 to 2020, about 20 years, only 16% of retail was transacted online. But then if we go from 2020 to just March 2020, that number jumped to 27% in 8 short weeks after the pandemic. And I don't think it's ever going back, which is crazy. And I think we're going to see a similar pattern in online education, where really online education had seen some adoption, low levels, but in 2020, the entire universe was thrown into complete adoption of online education. And I think that number isn't going to go back to where that baseline was ahead of coronavirus. Something else that he talked about was the economics of a pandemic. And there's some debate over whether our stock market might have replaced profits for vision and growth in those companies that they predict performing well. But there is no debate that during a pandemic, cash is king, and cost structure is the new blood oxygen level, if you will, as Mr. Galloway said. But companies with low debt, high value assets, low fixed costs will be well positioned to survive a pandemic. So if you're unfamiliar, Professor Scott Galloway teaches at NYU Stern. He's taught there for 10 years. He teaches a class of brand strategy. And for the last decade, he's taught this class to a full auditorium. This is NYU Stern's largest classroom, and it seats 160 students. But during coronavirus in 2020, Stern went virtual. So they expanded this classroom from 160 students to 280 students. We assume they paid some Zoom fees. They might have had to add a TA to make sure that all of the coursework can get processed, but Scott Galloway's salary didn't change, and it didn't require any more Manhattan real estate. So if you want to start thinking about how a school can decrease their cost per student by reaching more students, it would be by investing in the tech that allows you to really expand your class size without ever having to build up your corresponding physical facilities, increase your staff. You can really start to increase your revenue per student. Loved that Scott Galloway had actually experienced this himself. It's really interesting, and I would love to hear more thoughts on how it must have changed to teach to a live audience, to teach to a virtual audience. But this is certainly a trend that we are starting to see, particularly take hold within our traditional universities, and have them thinking about how they can bring their traditional students online. Taking traditional students and bringing them online is no small feat. In fact, it's going to be the biggest disruption the education space has seen in quite some time. Mr. Galloway poses that the disruptability factor, if you will, in the education industry is off the charts. So, if we take a step back and look at what's been happening in education, if you look back over the last 40 years, college tuition has increased by 1,400%. That's right, 1400. If you compare it to the increase in the consumer price index, that's only up just about 300% in the last 40 years. Education isn't necessarily alone. A lot of things have gone up. So again, we like to look to out of industry. Healthcare costs. Healthcare costs over the last 40 years have only increased 600%. So this increase that we're seeing in higher education is almost making healthcare seem affordable, which is wild. And what have we seen? With all of this increase in revenue and increase in cost, where is the innovation and where is the disruption taking place in higher education? I think we're only starting to see the tip of the iceberg, but it does feel like there's a lot of opportunity for this space to grow and change. And in fact, Scott ends his book with a few different recommendations that I think are pretty polarizing and really interesting. The first, increase seats at state schools and decrease the cost of 4-year and 2-year universities. His second recommendation is to just stop fetishizing the 4-year degree. It's cost prohibitive for many and also unnecessary for others. His third recommendation, and this was pretty wild, is that for those universities with over a $1 billion endowment, they should now be taxed if they're unable to expand their freshman seats at a rate greater than 1.5 times the population growth. Meaning these universities sitting on really large endowments need to start expanding access in a meaningful way and start turning that endowment towards something that can start to improve the number of students that are able to get access to such an incredible education. And the last recommendation that he lives, and this one's pretty divisive, is that we should not be pushing to make college free. Instead, he thinks we should be doing this because only 32% of Americans actually go to college. What he thinks we should do instead is improve the K-12 education, strengthen 2-year programs, increase seats at the best universities like we just discussed, and when you do this, college then becomes a tool for upward mobility, and it doesn't leave behind the 2/3 of students that would be better served by a stronger high school experience. He doesn't feel that we should be subsidizing education to the wealthiest homes where 88% of their children are already attending university. What do you think? Do you agree? I would love for you to leave us a note in the comments and start a conversation. So, overall, my thoughts on this book, in true Scott Galloway form, I thought that it was on the nose, no BS. I loved his look into higher education. He does a really great job of contextualizing trends that he's seeing with inside and outside of industry examples. It was truly an easy and wonderful, enjoyable read. I highly recommend everyone read PostCorona, especially as the world starts to return to normal.
Alex, it sounds like a fantastic read. Look forward to having the chance to read it myself sometime soon. And those 3 recommendations are both really creative and thought-provoking. So thank you for sharing them with all of us. And I really like that all the recommendations get at increasing access for higher education, which is one thing we all can and should get behind. Look forward to reading it sometime on my own. I'm thrilled today to be able to talk about a book I read over the summer, which is Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions by Jeff Selingo. Jeff Selingo, I've been a long-time reader of his. He's a reporter and editor at the Chronicle for Higher Education, and he's written a couple of books. This is his third. He wrote College Unbound in 2013, which was a book that shaped a lot of my early opinions on the higher education ecosystem. And then he also wrote There Is Life After College, which I have not yet read, but look forward to reading someday. Salingo also is currently the co-host of the Future You podcast with Michael Horn, and he has his own monthly newsletter. As indicated by the title, Salingo is focused on the college admissions process from a variety of angles. So he talks to parents and children, he talks to admissions counselors, to consultants, but I think what really makes this book special is that Salingo embeds himself with 3 universities, Emory, Davidson, and the University of Washington, and goes through their entire admissions process in the room with the teams that are making decisions. And I think it's this unique angle that is sort of what brings the book to life and gives it a uniqueness not seen in anything else I've read or listened to. One of the core takeaways for me from this book is what universities mean by holistic admissions, or admissions, the consideration of factors beyond something just like GPA and SAT scores, for example. And holistic admissions is really the way in which universities seek to shape their incoming freshman class in a way that attempts to create balance across a variety of factors. And that can be the geographies from which their incoming freshmen attend the school, so which areas of the country they went to high school. It can be their gender, it can be their intended major, it can be their the income level of their families. But it's the nuance of bringing all of these factors together on top of what we might consider just the pure merit-based factors like GPA or even SAT. And what Salingo's point is the admissions process is nuanced and complex, and it's maybe less formulaic than we all might have thought. And that for me was the most interesting thing, something I probably always knew, but was brought to life with the conversations that Salingo was a part of in this behind-the-scenes look he gets at these 3 universities. Salingo also talks about the changing admissions process. So recently, there has been a significant change with many schools moving to test optional admissions, and then even more. This was pre-pandemic, and then even more universities doing this during the pandemic. And I'm curious to see how many will stick with it or revert back to prior processes. And Salingo also talks about the likelihood of the admissions process to continue changing significantly in coming years. And he points to 2 things, one of which I agree with and one of which I'm not sure I do. And the first is that Gen Z is now of university age, and how he points out that the way they consume information and consume media is different than previous generations, and therefore it'll create a challenge for universities. And I actually think universities now have more channels and more means than ever to reach students, particularly those in Gen Z who are very digitally savvy. And there are all these digital mechanisms by which universities can reach students. So I actually think it's even easier now than it has been in the past for a university who wants to get its message to students to be able to do that. But the other point he makes, which is a critical one, is the upcoming demographic or high school cliff. The decreasing high school graduates from 2026 to 2031. And he points out the strain that will put on universities and particularly on admissions as they seek to shape their classes. And I'm curious to see how that plays out in the future. Salingo concludes with a handful of recommendations for parents and students, for the federal government, and for universities themselves. And so just to pick one that I particularly liked for universities, which is making the admissions process more simple to create less stress for students and their parents, and to make it easier on admissions departments who are going through thousands and thousands of applications. And he comes up with a couple of ideas. One is reducing the number of slots on an application for extracurricular activities, so it's less of a laundry list and more forces students just to pick the 1 or 2 or 3, and they can write a short blurb about why it's so important. He also talks about changing the essay from an open-ended process that students typically, or some students, will hire expensive tutors to be able to get their essay as refined as possible, to instead having more of an essay testing center within a high school counselor's office where a student just goes in, set time frame, randomly generated topic, and writes as much as they can in 30 minutes, which seems to me to be a more equitable process. So those were just a couple of his recommendations for simplifying the application process, all of which resonated with me to make it more equitable overall and to make it an easier process on universities themselves. For the rest of the recommendations, I highly suggest you check out or purchase Selingo's book, Who Gets In and Why, A Year Inside College Admissions, and look forward to seeing any notes that you might leave in the comments. Thank you, and Alex, I'll turn it back to you.
Wow, thanks, James. I follow Jeff Selingo on LinkedIn, and I think he always surfaces really great education content, crafts a lot of it, but I haven't read this book, so I can't wait to pick it up. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Please, in the comments, let us know what was your summer reading and what did you think of ours. We'd love to hear from you. Talk to you soon.